Hi everyone, welcome to the Beyond Seattle SRE Meetup. My name is Erza. I work as a marketing associate for Noble 9. I'm also one of the co-organizers of this amazing meetup. I want to start by giving a huge shout out to our amazing organizers and especially Kit Merker. He's the founder of this meetup, which he started back in December 2019. We had our first meetup in January 2020, where actually Steph Hippo was our first speaker at the Google office in Seattle. And today we have grown into a virtual meetup. We have over 500 members and we've had some amazing speakers join us. We've been lucky enough with amazing sessions and amazing discussions. So I'm really excited to have all of you join us today as well. I highly, especially if you're new to this, I highly want to recommend you check out our YouTube channel. We have a dedicated YouTube playlist for to our previous amazing SRE meetups, and you will be able to catch up with some of our old meetups, some of our old speakers. You'll see, you'll have a chance to really check out some great discussions. So I highly suggest you check that out. And if you, for some reason, haven't joined our Slack channel yet, make sure to do that. We have a Slack channel with members of almost 70 people right now, and we have some great discussion going on there related to SRE news and SRE updates. And we also happen to have a Slack channel that is dedicated to hiring. So if you're looking for a job, or you know someone that's looking for a job, or you're hiring SRE talent, then check out the Slack channel. I will share a link in a couple of seconds. The agenda for today is very straightforward. We have 2 speakers and we have some room for networking and discussion. We also have a Q&A at the very end. I suggest you all stick around through this entire meetup. It's going to be great. And it's finally time for me to introduce you to the first speaker. We have today here the amazing Jolene Kidney. Jolene is the program manager at Getty Images, and she also happens to be one of her amazing co-organizers. So thank you for doing this, Jolene. You always bring on such a good discussion and perspective. So it's really good to have you speak today. And Jolene will be speaking about the what, why, and how of Blameless Postmortems. Everyone, Jolene Kidney.
All right, so let's go ahead and kick this thing off. So I'm going to start with telling you a little bit about me. And the reason I wanted to talk about that is that today, what brings us to talking about Blameless Postmortems is regarding the journey that we've taken at Getty Images and how we got to the point of deciding that we needed to implement a new Blameless Postmortem practice. But this is a little bit about my journey. And so here I am right now. This is how you know me as today. I'm a program manager at Getty Images. And one of the primary initiatives that I'm working on is the Site Reliability Engineering Initiative. But that's not how I began. Several decades or a couple of decades ago, I graduated with a degree in biology. So nothing to do with technology, but still in kind of the STEM area, right? So I spent the first 2 decades of my career in the area of scientific research and development. I worked on creating treatments, cures, and just general research in different areas, ranging from infectious disease to cancer, and finally ending in brain science itself. So although those years had some definite rewards, I wanted to be able to grow a little bit more my softer skills and focus more in the area of technology, which at that point brought me to Getty Images as a product owner in our tech services department, focusing on internal productivity tools like Slack, Zoom, Office 365. And towards the end of my role, in tech services, I picked up enterprise monitoring team, which started me down the path I'm on today. After helping that team launch PagerDuty and continuing to refine our current set of observability tools, I was asked to move into the role of program manager overseeing our site reliability initiative. As I was looking for a picture of me in science, this is what you see is me standing in front of a scientific poster that I was presenting. And I don't know if you can see this, but the title that you see right up there of this particular area of research. It's really hard to see, but it was about abnormal postmortem brain morphology. So there we go. Even before I got into the area of SRE, I had already touched on the area of postmortems. So what I want to talk about today, like I said in my title, is the what, the why, and the how. And I'm also going to touch on always improving at the end, because I would not be a good program manager if we didn't talk about how to continuously improve. So first off, I just want to kind of set the table a little bit about what is a postmortem. So when you go to Merriam-Webster, this is what you see. You see these definitions come up. And primarily what I want to focus on is this very last definition that says this is an analysis or discussion of an event after it's over. This is the way we normally think about postmortems in technology. Now, when I went to go look up the word blameless, Merriam-Webster refused to give me a definition. It only gave me a definition of blame and then said, oh, and by the way, you can use this as blameless, blamelessness. Here's all these alternatives that you have. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So let's talk a little bit about what blame is. So blame is being at fault, right? We say this thing or this person is at fault for this thing happening. Or it's also an expression of disapproval or reproach. And I think as a human being, that feeling of disapproval or reproach, that doesn't feel very good, right? So we've already had an incident, we've already had something that we need to talk about and analyze. But when blame comes on the scene, then there's always this sense of, somebody's pointing the finger, somebody's unhappy or disappointed with you. So this is one reason we decided we need to get rid of this. We need to get rid of a culture of blame and move to this culture of blamelessness. So then we began to ask ourselves, well, what is a blameless postmortem? Is it a process? Is it a document? Is it a meeting? Is it a culture? And you can probably guess what the answer was. It's yes to all of these things. It is all of these things. So that's what I want to talk a little bit further about. But before I do that, I need to tell you a little bit more about Getty and how we do SRE. So one thing that's very important that would really set a stage for us to be able to adopt SRE practices was moving to AWS. And we did this in, I want to say, a little over a year. We moved out of all of our data centers and we moved to the cloud. So that really gave us the ability to start kicking off SRE in 2019. And our initial focus was finding a metrics platform. So up to that point, we'd only had a logging platform. So in order to set SLOs and have real-time metrics, we felt like that was an important foundation that we needed to lay. So we went about looking at the different options out there and landed on an open source product. You've probably heard of it, Prometheus. And we combine that with Grafana to do our visualizations. And from there, we've built other sets of internal tools that have helped our developers and engineers be able to onboard and be able to start establishing these things. However, technology within Getty, even though we have offices all over the world and we have somewhere around, I think, 17 to 1,800 full-time employees, our technology department all up is around 350. And that ranges from anything from help desk and tech services, like where I started, into our application developers. So because this is not a huge technology team, we don't have SRE teams in and of themselves. Like when you read about it in the Google book and we talk about SREs or SRE teams, we don't have that concept at Getty. We have what we consider an SRE enablement team. So the team that has brought about the platform and continues to develop tools that enables the rest of our technology org to be able to adopt other SRE practices and do things like establish SLOs and set up alerts on those SLOs, understand what error budgets are and those sorts of things. So this is why it really becomes important for our entire organization to understand the value of a blameless postmortem. So then we started saying, well, then why do we do this? Why do we think this is so important? Well, we started with an initial problem. So one of our problems is that our engineers are often or almost all the time focusing on product work. So when they're focusing almost 100% on product work, it becomes very difficult to stay up to date on operational support. Although they were all very, very much understanding when we moved to AWS, right? We moved to the cloud. We did a lot of learning around that, and we assumed that all of that learning stuck with them. But actually, it's been kind of hard because when your focus is 100% on product work, it can be difficult to either remember all those things, or you guys all know how fast things change, right? How things, when we launched AWS 2 years ago versus what are all the different kinds of services that you can avail yourself to today, right? It becomes very difficult to stay up to date on that. So we have a goal, and the goal is to improve the feedback loop and empower all our engineering staff. So again, because we don't have SRE teams, we need to be able to really make this happen for all of our engineering staff. So we want to empower that engineering staff to perform operations work that primarily arises from incidents. So the way it works at Getty is that we have, and all of our development teams or our product teams, they are all on call, right? So they're supposed to support those platforms. We don't have different groups of people or different groups of on-call. So we have on-call rotations that need to be kept up to date, but because they're focusing on their product work so frequently, we don't always know how to stay up to date on those things. So we decided the postmortem process would really help us, or help our engineers, to be able to stay up to date on that and actually feel more confident. And I know Rich is going to talk about on call after me. So feel a little bit more confident about when they go on call that they have some more knowledge to be able to answer those pages. So our desired impact, because we don't do anything if we don't think it's not, if it's not going to have impact, why do it, right? So we wanted to increase our learning from our high priority incidents to improve the ability for engineers to troubleshoot, remediate, and understand when and how to escalate high priority incidents. So when things come through, and by the way, implementing SRE, we start to have SLO breach alerts coming through, right? Whoops, we're burned through this budget a little too fast. We need them to be able to understand those things a lot better. So that's the first area of impact. We also want to foster openness, right? So we want to, while building this new process out, we want to have a culture of blamelessness. So we want to train our people and help them know how we can learn from our mistakes. And of course, right? Why would we be here? Why would we be here at the SRE meetup if we didn't want to improve the reliability of our sites and services? So then that's kind of what we approached with as organizationally, why this was important for us to do. But then you might ask, what's the incentive for the engineer? Well, we just talked about this, operational competence, right? This is only going to help grow you when you participate in the postmortem process. Incident prevention. When you're on call, boy, you'd sure like things to be more stable so you get called less often, right? One of the areas is we've been moving into a more remote culture, and one with asynchronous meetings. We're trying to move more and more to having things written down as opposed to having to be in meetings, having to have those discussions to be able to be in the know. So one of the things that underlies that is that we all need to be improving our writing skills so that we can communicate in that asynchronous fashion. Professional growth, right? This is an area that you may start out and go like, I'm not feeling terribly confident about the postmortem process, how to either write a postmortem or run a postmortem meeting. Well, this is an area for somebody to grow in. We can also celebrate a job well done, even when the incident feels negative. So we can talk about what went well. We can talk about a well-written postmortem. We can talk about how it helped other people in the organization avoid things, right? So that's another incentive. And then finally, for people who are a little bit further down the road, this is an opportunity to be a mentor for the writing or leading postmortems. So here's our process in a snapshot. First, so we have what we call our network operations right? Our knock, right? So, or they're kind of evolving a little bit more into an incident command team. Again, because we used to be a couple years ago, right? Everything was in the data centers. Our knock had a lot more activities they used to do. But now that we're in the cloud, things that have become a little bit more complicated. It's hard to just write KB articles for them to know how to do things, because when things break, things are a lot more complex and need a lot more deeper digging. So the knocks still exist though, because they're 24/7 for us, right? They're always around. So they are there immediately when a high priority incident hits. We call our high priority instances either a Pri 1 or Pri 2. So the knock after that incident is over is going to send a link to the postmortem document. So we created a template, so it becomes very easy to fill in all the different parts. And I'll talk about the document in just a moment. So they're going to send that link out to who we deem is the person that will be the postmortem owner. Generally, we say the postmortem owner is likely the one that the service or the platform was either most impacted by the incident, or was potentially the root cause of the incident, or has the majority of the work to be done to remediate the incident. So that's usually how we determine which group should own it. And then the postmortem owner is going to be an engineer who was on call, the engineer who worked the actual incident. They're going to be the ones with the most intimate knowledge of what happened. Now, moving back to, that may be an uncomfortable place for engineers, right? I don't feel terribly confident about that. And that's why we do some additional things, not only this training, but we provide a mentor for every single postmortem owner, so they're not in it alone. So they're going to fill out the sections in this template. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what happens if this is sort of like a cross team or cross platform issue that happened? What do we do then? Well, we still are going to determine who we think is the best postmortem owner, but we also tell them this is not something that you just have to do alone, right? This is something you're supposed to reach out and collaborate and collect information. And then ideally, we want to have this document sent out 24 hours prior to the meeting. And that the reason that we want that to happen is that everybody who's attending that meeting has a chance to have time, and who knows what time zone that they may be in, they need to be able to have a chance to digest that information. And then finally, the incident commander is going to schedule that meeting. So we don't leave that to the postmortem owner. We have the incident commander do that. And they schedule it with all the pertinent participants. And then after that meeting, we make sure to update that document with any other pertinent details. So quickly, here's the basics of our document. It has an overview, it has a timeline, it has what did go well and didn't go well. And I often in postmortems, we tend to focus on what didn't go well, because that's what's brought us here. But you want to also focus on what did go well. What are the things that you think, like, did we detect it fast? Did we have the right team called right away? Did we already have some resiliency in place that really came in handy, right? So call out those things, because those things are learnings that are beneficial to not only the people who are involved, but also could be for anybody else who's going to read this document at a later time. So what didn't go well, then we get down into the details. Let's get to the nitty gritty. Let's paste those graphs, right, where we did our deep dive to figure out what broke where, when, and how. We'll put that in the details. And then finally, action items. So here's some tips that we give people with the document. You need to own it. So got to own this document. Make sure it's well done, right? Don't do just a couple sentences here and there and send it out. But again, you're not in it alone. You need to collaborate with those around you, and you need to utilize your mentor. Remember, these learnings are critical now and later. So not only are they beneficial for the postmortem that we're discussing at hand, but these learnings are things that might come in handy down the road. And then finally, continuous improvement and reliability. This is why we're doing this. So we want that to be a focus of those postmortems. What we did decide to do with all of our postmortem documents is we actually put them on our SharePoint site. So at Getty, we utilize SharePoint to share things broadly in the organization. We have other tech tools like GitLab that we put other information, but we put them all on SharePoint in a document library because we want them to be widely available. And we want them to be searchable. So what you see here in this document library is we can search via keywords, and that will pull up different postmortem documents that had to do with that particular thing. So again, we really wanted to advance and make at the fingertips of anybody who needs it to be able to do that digging and that learning when they need to. So let's talk about the meeting a little bit. Remember how I said we want that document sent 24 hours prior to it? Is because do not spend the time at this meeting reading your entire document to everybody, right? So the expectation is that people show up and have become familiar with this material. So we ask them to keep it brief. Just touch on that overview, the timeline with some very significant, like this is when it was discovered, this is when we figured out what was broken, this is when this person jumped on, this is when it was fixed. We, brief timeline there. And then again, what went well, what didn't go well. And then we spend a lot more time in the action items, which I will talk about more in depth shortly. The attendees for this meeting this was a little bit of a change for us. We normally kind of scoped our postmortem meetings very small. But we're trying to broaden that by making sure that we have a few other people involved that we didn't necessarily think in the past were that important for us to have. So of course we start out with those involved. Anybody who's involved in the incident, they need to be there. We need our decision makers for action items to be there. So our engineers are very, very knowledgeable, have really great ideas about what we could do to be able to prevent this thing from happening or to give ourselves more stability in the future. But if the decision makers aren't present, then it just ends up being a lot of good ideas, and we don't necessarily have the ability to make sure those things get done, because again, we're sometimes competing with a lot of product work that we want to deliver as well. So we need to make sure our decision makers are there. And then other SMEs or learners are welcome. It's not mandatory, but they're welcome to this, because again, we need to, our problem that we're trying to address here is extend the operational learning. And then finally, focus on action items, ideas. We put those down, talk about owners, risk assessment, of what would the risk be if we don't do this, commitment, and then a link to what we consider a team's board, so where the work gets managed. I don't know if you guys use Kanban boards where you are, but for us, we use Kanban boards that really determine the prioritization and how work flows through for teams. So depending on whatever the owning team of that action item would be, they would end up with that on their list. This was a pivot for us, as we used to have more of a problem management team that would kind of try and continue to keep track of those and go hunt people down and like say, hey, why didn't you get this thing done? And so we're moving away from that, because we want service ownership, right? You should know about the health of your platform and its stability and the areas and the things that need to be improved and how you'd improve that. So we're just handing that piece over. So I just want to talk a little bit about action items. So with action items, we've asked to do this new process, which is the risk assessment of not doing it. So what would be the impact to the customer, or what would be the probability of this happening again if we don't do this action item? So the reason that we're doing this is that you guys all probably know there's way more work that could be done than can be done. And so this is a way for us to remove some of that cognitive burden for us as an organization, to feel like we created a long list of items that we think that we should do and that we kind of never get to. And perhaps in there, some things are getting lost in the mix. So we're not focusing on the right things and getting those really high risk things done when we really should, because we've created this long list. So we're putting this risk assessment process in place. So you may ask yourself, well, why do we need to prioritize and commit to action items? Well, first off, one of the reasons that we don't feel like we can say, no, we're not going to do something, is because we don't trust in the blamelessness culture, right? So this culture, though, supports us not deciding to do something and possibly being wrong. Nobody wants to say, I chose not to do it, and then have that thing come back again, right? But that blameless culture tells us we made the best decision at the time with the information we had. So we did the assessment. We decided that it wasn't a 4 or a 5. It was 3 or less. And so we decided we weren't going to do it. That culture tells us that if it comes back again, guess what? That was another piece of information that put us up on that probability scale. And now that risk level just went higher, right? So that is one reason that we need to be able to do that. And in addition, suggested items not to be moved forward with still have value in our learning and research. So even if we decide not to do something, but we go back, remember I was showing you, we can look at those keywords, we go back and we can say, hey, this popped up, this recommendation has popped up 3 different times, right? This can help us make better decisions, right? And then we can't do everything we should, right? So this is why I prioritize on risk, and that we need to move forward as one, as an organization, right? So we need to have alignment. So in this meeting itself, we decide, we prioritize, we commit so we can move forward as one. And if something doesn't make the cut, that's okay. We're moving forward as one. If things do need to make the cut, they've been assessed as high, then we need to be able to move forward as one. So let's talk a little bit about the blameless culture itself. Why is that important? Well, we need people to feel like they can talk about their mistakes without the fear of blame, shame, or retribution. In addition to that, we also need to be very intentional about, when we're writing or conducting these meetings, about removing biases. Let's talk a little bit about some bias types. There's the first bias type I want to talk about is the fundamental attribution error. That just seems like a lot of words altogether, but what it really means is it says we think that what something has done. So if somebody was potentially the cause of an incident, right? I made a change and it caused this thing, that sometimes we attribute to a person a characteristic like, well, that team or that person is lazy or not very technical, or they have bad leadership, or whatever it is. We tend to attribute that based on that incident, but that's not necessarily true, and it's not helpful for the organization. So we should really discuss what questions instead of who questions. So let's not talk about teams, let's not talk about people, let's talk about the system, the infrastructure, the process, like what fell down, what could be improved there. Confirmation bias. So this is really just reinforces our existing position, right? Like, yep, this just proves my point of view, right? I've been saying this all along. So we want to stay away from this. Again, this doesn't really help us make decisions. This doesn't help the organization. So try to, you could, if you want, try playing the devil's advocate. Try and be on the counter side. So if you think about a debate team, right? You have a topic and you don't know if you're going to be pro or con. Think about where you might normally land and then try to think about it from the opposite side. Hindsight bias. Oh yeah, I knew this was coming. I could predict this thing was going to happen. I've been saying this for so long that if we didn't do X, Y, or Z, this thing would happen, right? Again, this does not help us, right? This is not proving anything for us. This is just information that kind of maybe makes us feel better, right? So what we want to do is we want to explain the events in terms of foresight instead, right? Start with your timeline analysis at the point of the incident and work your way forward instead of backwards. And then finally, negativity bias. So you've probably heard it say it takes 10 good things to outweigh the one bad thing. So this can be really true. And sometimes we even use this as a weapon where we can try to tell people, oh, this thing is huge. You should feel bad about this. This thing was catastrophic, right? Sometimes we use those things because we feel like we really need to cement for people that this thing was really, really bad. Well, trust me, people already are kind of feeling a little bit that way. We don't need to reinforce that. So instead, we need to reframe incidents as learning opportunities, right? This is an opportunity for us to learn something new, figure out what we can do differently. How can we make something better? And finally, I already kind of mentioned this, but a really key thing is just avoid using names as much as you can. Trust me, that person knows, that person's manager knows, right? If they were caused, do not put them in documents, do not use them in meetings, avoid using those names. That will only solidify for people how they will be more willing to share, right? They will be more willing to say, hey, I made this mistake. This is something that everybody can learn from, right? Finally, I wanted to talk about how you should use feedback. So this is always improving, right? We always want to improve. So when we built out this process, we did this in sort of a beta phase. So we put a lot of this material together in partnership with the manager of our ITSM program, and we engaged engineers to help make the process better. So we had an old process, then we started introducing some new ideas, and then we asked for a couple beta testers and said, hey, can we run this through for our next few incidents, high priority incidents we have, and tell us how it could be better. And we got some really good feedback. This template was hard to use. It didn't make sense. At first, we had them scheduling meetings themselves, and they said, you know what, it'd be really much better if the incident commander schedules that meeting. So engage your engineers. They're the ones that are, right, boots on the ground. Ask them how this process could be better. And then finally, the postmortems themselves can capture lots of different kinds of changes. They can capture potential changes to processes, to the documents themselves, to practices that you have, right? Like we have this common practice here in technology. What kind of monitoring, to the SLOs themselves, right? We're always interested in refining our SLOs. And again, I didn't create all of this out of my own genius. I partnered with a lot of people and of course used the Google SRE workbook regarding the postmortem culture. And then I also leveraged a lot of information and good practices from PagerDuty. And with that, I'll end. Urza, I know you said maybe leave some time for questions, or we can move on depending on time.
Sure, I think we could do some questions if somebody has a couple, or that could wait till the Q&A session.
Urza, I have a question.
Good.
I have two questions, actually. One is serious and one is lighthearted. The lighthearted question is, Jolene, I really like these slides. I'm wondering, maybe are these all Getty licensed images? Is that where the background art came from?
Yeah,
and,
some of those images you'll see, I have like little numbers and who the creator was. So yes, those are licensed images.
I was curious what those were. Okay, all right. And my second question is, what metrics do you track to quantify how well all this is working? Like, it could be something simple like mean time to detect, or maybe something else, but educate me if you could.
Yeah, so I should have made sure our ITSM manager was here, because they've been actually tracking a lot of that for some time, and they do have mean time to detect. And one of our the one that we use the most is the duration of the incidents themselves. So we oftentimes, like, where we're really trying to drive down is that duration of the incident. So we're not so concerned about how many incidents, we're more concerned with how long those incidents take to resolve. So mean time to resolve. So we definitely track that.
Got it. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions?
A quick question, just from how you might deal with this. How do you ensure that some of those action items actually get followed up on in a timely fashion?
Oh, Dylan, this is like our yeah, this is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have. And so for transparency here, this is a rebooted process that we just put in place. So we're still trying to figure out, like, how good will the adoption be, but I can tell you the reason that we put that risk assessment process in place is to try and mitigate that problem that you're talking about. So that's why we need the decision makers there, and that's why we need to make some prioritization and commitment during the meeting itself. So I'll probably have more information for you in the next several weeks to come.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I like that matrix. That's kind of different than how our teams do that. So that was kind of an interesting idea. I was curious how that was working. So, all right, thanks.
I also had a question. You talked about the value of the postmortems being searchable. How much do people actually go back and search for, like when they're writing a postmortem, search for, has this cause ever happened before? What has it looked like in other incidents? Or like, do program managers on a quarterly basis go through and sort of try to pull out what is the low-hanging fruit that we should be working on in the next quarter? How do you actually get value from the searchability?
Yeah, I think so. Again, that is a newer process for us to solve the other problem that we have. So we had historically put our postmortem documents were kind of like a series of 6 questions that we're ultimately trying to get to the information that we have in our new postmortem document. But it was more like it felt like a tax that you had to pay when you had an incident happen. Oh, I got to fill out the postmortem report, right? And then we put that into a location, into our kind of like our well, into ServiceNow, quite frankly. So that's where we put those, and they ended up being really not valuable for maybe anybody else except for potentially our problem manager. So they weren't really available. If you really tried, you could dig deep, run a report, find the thing, if you knew the incident number, those kinds of things. So it was much more difficult to be able to do that. So what we did is we just decided, hey, we're gonna move out of that, and we're gonna put them into this searchable location. And what we already found, even when in our beta phase that we were in, is that people, when they knew that we were kind of revamping and changing a lot of these questions, they even began to share some of their postmortems in Slack, right? So they'd be able to kind of like try to share this information a little bit more broadly. So we wanted to make sure to not, like, Slack is not a good place for document repository. I mean, yes, it has some pretty good search capabilities, but we really wanted to put them in a place where they were more searchable, more easy to find than in those other locations that they had previously existed. So from there, we have not yet, I don't predict that our program managers will probably be using it frequently to determine what the roadmap of things that we need to do next are. And again, I think when it comes to action items themselves, those things end up, things we commit to end up on a work management board. So really the basis there for having that library of information is to draw upon, either to be able to share more broadly to other people in the organization, so it's readily accessible, or as we continue to build our repository, then maybe we can begin to draw on that. So already I know that I had a discussion recently with a manager who was saying like, hey, because I've been involved with a couple of these different postmortems, this particular thing has now popped up 3 separate times. And I think it's something that we need to escalate to our technical leadership. So I think that's the kind of value that we see coming out of that.
Hey, I have a quick question. This is Kit here. And by the way, it's so nice to be here as an attendee. Thank you. Thank you. Urza. You're doing great. Jolene is a great one. I was going to ask you, you were talking about doing the docs, making people read them ahead of time. Have you thought about, or have you experimented with the Amazon approach of doing like everybody shows up and reads quietly and then does it? Is that something you've thought about, or not so much?
Yeah, and that was a question that we had posed to us recently as well, and we may pivot to that depending on the adoption of this. So one of the things that we would like about this postmortem meeting, or one of the things that we've found, at least in our new COVID world, is that it's difficult to get everybody into the same room. And if you try to account for time for reading, then you just add to the length of the meeting itself. So the reason that we didn't go out of the gate with that Amazon model is that really we could have as many as 15, 20 people that need to be at this postmortem meeting. And so if we just say, hey, this information you're going to have to like, and again, one of the benefits of sending it ahead is that not everybody consumes and digests information at the same pace. So if you have non-English, like people that don't have English as a first language, right, might take them a little bit longer to read that and digest that document, right? So it's a little bit more, the idea here is, I know it's challenging because for us, we're trying to also move away from a culture where you have to be in a meeting to get the information that you need, to be moving to a more written communication organization where we can communicate a lot of those same things that we would have normally communicated in a meeting itself. And then we give people the ability to have time, like if they want to be able to make notes, or they need a little bit more time, or they want to think about it. Maybe people don't think on the fly very well in terms of action items, right? And so that's the idea of sending it beforehand, is that sort of evens that playing field. But again, that is something that we're going to continue to look at, because that Amazon model of just, coming in the room and dropping the pens on the table and say, mark it up in the next, however many minutes, and then we'll start the meeting. That will be something we'll keep looking at.
I can say, as a relatively recent Amazon escapee from the AWS world, that actually does work. Outage reports, incident meetings like that, you were responsible. We would have 5 minutes for everybody to just go over a short document. The document was deliberately kept short. But whoever, and you were responsible essentially for knowing what was in the document, and those who didn't were responsible for writing the outage report. So that was kind of the punishment for it.
Natural incentives. I like it. Definitely let us know, Jolene, as you experiment with this. Definitely let us know what you find out. We got to report back.
So it looks like we have the main group, just waiting for a few more. So did anyone share something fun that they want to share here in the main session too, at the breakout rooms? We always ask this.
Yeah, so one thing that a team really early in my career, my boss did, was we would turn recovery and postmortems into pizza parties when we were all still in the same hangar. And so if you broke something, that would cue somebody to go order a bunch of pizza, and we'd all just hang out and eat pizza until we got it fixed and figure out what we did and what we should not have done. So, that putting a slice of pizza in people's hands really got everybody to move past being, afraid to say something, or afraid like, oh my God, I broke it. It's like, when that turns into a pizza party, it's not scary anymore.
You didn't have people intentionally breaking things so they could get free pizza?
No, we luckily never got to that point. We still had some pretty hard ass people, well above us, so we didn't want to push our luck.
So did you just make them pay for the pizza?
No, we had a kitty. Every month, everybody would just kind of donate to the kitty, and that was our pizza fund. And so it's like you got an extra $3 in your pocket, throw it in the kitty. And
okay, so where do you work, and do you have any job openings?
So I don't do this for my team now, but I did that for the first place was a DoD contractor when we were on base in Florida, and then I brought that here with me when I came to San Antonio. But I do have open positions, so if anybody's looking for a job, check out the Slack jobs channel.
Thank you so much for sharing, Zach. And we will have more time for discussion and Q&A at the end. But now I will introduce the second speaker. This is a talk I've been really excited to hear. And thank you for joining your meetup, Rich. So everyone, Rich Boris, and he will be talking about what On-Call does to us. Rich, whenever you're ready, take over.
Yeah, I need you to stop sharing. There we go. Can you all see the slides?
Yes.
The singular slide? All right, rad. Yeah, so we're just going to talk today a little bit about what science can tell us about the impact of being on call, which is something I don't hear discussed an awful lot. Oops. There we go. I'm Rich Burroughs. I work in DevRel, formerly worked in SRE and Ops. I'm actually not here plugging anything today. I'm between jobs, but I'm very hireable. And I'm at Rich Burroughs on Twitter. So it was 1996. It was a simpler time. This was the year that Independence Day was released. I had gotten a call center job at an internet provider and then promoted to be a sysadmin. And then my boss got me a pager. So I was the only sysadmin at the company, and I was suddenly on call for a small number of Linux hosts, like maybe 5 to 10 hosts, but I was on call all the time. And honestly, I think I was probably pretty excited about this. Suddenly I had some extra responsibility. I had to make sure that these servers were up all the time. So fast forward 20 years, I had worked next as a sysadmin at WebMD when the company was taking out Super Bowl ads. Then I worked at a web hosting company, a payments company, a company with an email marketing platform. And then finally, I was an SRE at Puppet. And during that 20 years, I'd been on call for most of the time in rotations of different sizes. Some of those were as small as 3 people, which is too small for an on-call rotation, and some were as big as 10. I was at one company where our boss actually divided up the day into time slots, and you were always on call every day during the same time slot. And I managed to draw the time slot of 7 p.m. to midnight. So I was on call every evening, all the time, which was awesome. So, during this 20 years, my mental health had deteriorated. I started having very bad claustrophobia and had panic attacks when I would board airplanes. The first time it happened, I actually had this little debate with myself. I was saying, hey, I could just tell the airline people to let me off the plane and they'd have to let me off, right? So, I was eventually diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. I've also had some pretty rough periods of depression where I'd be in bed for like even a week straight. Now, just want to make it clear, I'm not saying that this was for being on call directly. A lot of other things have happened in my life. I was recently diagnosed with ADHD, and I think that's been a big factor. But I also can't imagine that being on call for most of 20 years helped with my anxiety and depression. So my point here is that we all have stories about being on call. If you talk to anyone who's been through it, they can likely tell you about some of the pain that they felt. And some of us talk about these things a lot. I hear a lot of these stories from some of my peers. But this is all anecdotal. We all have biases, and we're unreliable narrators of our own lives. Meanwhile, scientists, psychologists, and other scientists have been studying the effect of being on call for decades. I think sometimes as people in tech, we think we know it all, and we ignore the work of people in other disciplines, but we should learn from them instead. So what we're going to do, I'm going to share with you a few scientific studies about being on call. Psychological studies are a great way to identify things that are counterintuitive or areas that we're blind to due to our biases. Keep in mind that individual studies are just one data point. Usually as part of the scientific process, you would have studies confirmed so that you can make sure other people get the same results. And also do keep in mind that I'm not a mental health professional. So before we get to the on-call studies, let's just talk for a moment about sleep, which is something that's been studied quite a bit. We all know, of course, that on-call can lead to sleep deprivation. There's a really great TED Talk from 2019 by a sleep scientist named Matt Walker. He's also written a book. And his team did a study where they divided the participants up into 2 groups. One group slept normally, and the other one was sleep deprived. And what they found is that people in the sleep deprived group had a 40% learning deficit compared to the other group. Now, this is, I've been woken up by pager duty many times over the years. I felt a lot of the physical impact of that. But I don't honestly think that I'd ever considered that during those times when I was having really rough on-call periods, I also wasn't learning as much. Some of the other things that Matt Walker mentions that can be caused by sleep deprivation, I'll let you read this. It is kind of a scary list. All right, so let's talk now specifically about these on-call studies. Some things to consider when looking at these types of studies. Many of the studies look at people in other professions. When I was poking around, I actually didn't find any that were specific to people in tech. They usually were either people in another profession, like doctors have been studied quite a bit, or they're just broad studies that talk about, people who have to be available. Some of them are focused on people who have to be on site, and some are not. Some of us do still have to go to data centers and touch hardware occasionally. And some of them look at what's called extended work availability. That phrase is going to come up. And what that means, basically, think of our on-call as like a subset of extended work availability. It just basically means that you could be interrupted, outside of the normal work hours. So you might think of a PR person, who if there's some fire that happens, after 5 p.m., they're still going to get a call or a text message about it. All right, so the first of these studies, this one is called The Relationship of On-Call Work with Fatigue, Work-Home Interference, and Perceived Performance Difficulties from 2015. So the methodology here, they did a survey of employees. They had a really big group, and then they narrowed that down to a final sample of 157. The subjects were, roughly in the age range that I think you see in tech a lot, and were predominantly males. And this one focused specifically on people who, did not have to go somewhere. What they found is that employees' experience of being on call, especially the experience of stress due to the unpredictability, rather than the amount of exposure that is related to fatigue, work-home interference, and perceived on-call performance difficulties. So work-home interference is basically what it sounds like. It's a negative interaction between those two domains of work and home. And so what they found here is that it was actually the unpredictability, rather than the amount of exposure, which would in our case be like the number of incidents or maybe the duration of them. It was just the unpredictability, the unpredictability itself had an impact on people. And they found that even a low amount of on-call hours a month and even a low frequency of being called to work can be related to an increase in fatigue and work-home interference when employees experience being on-call negatively. So folks who have a negative association with being on call, can still have this impact to them, even if they're not getting many alerts, even if they're not getting pulled into many incidents. The study also mentions this idea of psychological detachment, which refers to mentally disengaging from work and not thinking about work-related issues. A lack of detachment relates to negative recovery-related outcomes, such as fatigue, work-home interference, and emotional exhaustion. So that ability to be able to unplug, from work is one of the things that lets us recover. All right, study number 2. This one is called Extended Work Availability and its relation with start of day mood and cortisol from 2016. So this one was another survey. They had 132 people from 13 organizations. They did it 4 days when the people were on call and then 4 days when they weren't. And then they had a subset of 51 people who actually provided morning cortisol levels. So the findings here, they found significant effects of extended work availability on the daily start of mood and the cortisol awakening response. So what is the cortisol awakening response? I actually had never heard of this. It's an increase between 38 and 75% of cortisol levels peaking 30 to 45 minutes after awakening in the morning in some people. Now they don't actually know for sure why this happens, the cortisol awakening response. But this one hypothesis is that the cortisol rise after awakening may accompany an activation of prospective memory representations at awakening, enabling individuals' orientation about the self in time and space, as well as anticipation of demands of the upcoming day. So if this theory is true, You know, think of it maybe as like, you know, just rebooting in the morning, right? Resetting, you know, your mind kind of getting, you know, ready for the upcoming day. And of course, you know, it seems like having that be impacted in a negative way by being on call, you know, could potentially have a lot of effects on someone's life. And this is an impact to our bodies that I actually wouldn't have known about, you know, digging into this. As long as I'd been on call and as much as I thought I knew about it, you know, it wasn't until I actually ran across this study that I knew about the specific impact. Now, if anything that I've said so far wasn't clear, you know, about that study, just take a look at this table for a minute and you will understand it all. So my point in showing you this is that some of these studies can be pretty hard to parse if you're not an academic. I'm not. I was a theater major in college and I actually dropped out twice. So I'm about as far from being academic as you can get. So if you run into one of these studies that you're interested in, but you find it kind of hard to parse, one thing you can try is looking to see if there are secondary sources that talk about it. In the case of this study, I did actually find an article in Scientific American about it. And what they mentioned is that participants marked lower moods the morning after being on call. The possibility alone impeded recovery from work as the effects persisted even when no calls came. So this is actually really reminiscent of that first study that we talked about, right? Where again, it talked about the fact that, you know, this impact was there just because of the uncertainty of being on call. And it goes on to say, people who were able to detach from work even while on call were most likely to recoup their energies and avoid effects on mood and cortisol. So again, that concept of psychological detachment is coming up again, just like the first study. And this third study is a little bit different than the first two. It's called Understanding the Differing Impacts of On-Call Work for Males and Females, results from an online survey in 2019. So they did a survey of 228 subjects. They look at sex differences related to on-call, not gender. So this is very binary, it's male and female. Although it was an online survey, so people probably self-identified, it's not super clear. But the findings, the results indicated that female respondents were more likely to be responsible for running their household. And they also mentioned that there are previous studies that show that women spend nearly twice as long as men on childcare and domestic duties. So a few questions that they asked in the study. How much does on-call work interfere with the sort of things you'd like to do in your leisure time, like sports, activities, and hobbies? And as you can see, you know, there's a lot more of the female respondents who are saying that it impacts them a lot or very much. How much does on-call work interfere with the domestic things that you have to do in your time off work, like domestic tasks and children? And less of an impact this time. But again, you know, we're seeing that the female respondents say a lot and very much at a much higher rate. And how much does on-call work interfere with the non-domestic things that you have to do in your time off, like going to the doctor, the library, the bank? This is even less of an impact, but again, you know, still a lot more females saying a lot or very much than the men. So this is something that was another big surprise to me. I'm single, I don't have any children. It totally makes sense to me when I think about it all, you know, but it wasn't something that I had considered beforehand. So I think it's important to know that, you know, we're all individuals, we're all in different situations, and that, you know, there are people who have a higher impact from being on call than maybe I do because of, you know, their family, their children, whatever it is, you know, we're all different. So to summarize the studies, the uncertainty of being on call can be impactful even if there are no incidents. Mental detachment can help with recovery, and being on call interferes more with some people's lives than others. So, you know, we all know on call is hard. Anyone who's been through it, but what are some ways that we can improve it? specifically to reduce that stress of uncertainty. One of the things we can do is improve our incident response. So we can use incident response tooling for better communication and collaboration. We can improve our other tooling, like our observability tools, so we can, get to the information we need during an incident. And we can learn from incidents after the fact, and that includes retrospectives after the fact. The folks in the resilience engineering space have a lot to say about this idea of learning from your incidents. Something else that I think can help that I think as an industry not great at is on-call training. This could be done in a lot of different ways, but I think, one important focus is training for the incident response roles, like, what an incident commander does. You could also do fire drills and tabletop exercises. When I worked at Puppet, we actually did tabletop exercises where we kind of role played through the incident response so that we could learn the process. And then chaos engineering is something else you can do. You could inject faults into a system and then practice how you would respond as sort of a fire drill. So you might do that in, a non-production environment, a staging environment, or something like that. Changing how we alert is super helpful, making sure that alerts are actionable. Of course, I hope in this day and age, not a lot of us are alerting on things like 50% CPU load. That was a lot more common when I started out, but people are finding smarter ways to do alerting. I think that one of those is alerting based on SLOs and error budgets. And quick plug for Alex. Some of you may have heard of this book. I had a chance to interview Alex for a blog post right before the book came out, and he has a lot of really interesting things to say about this specific topic of like how you tie alerting to SLOs in a way to make your life less painful. All right, and then another thing that we can do as a team is just having empathy, having each other's backs. If you see that someone's having a really rough week, tap them out, just hit them on the shoulder and be like, hey, can I take your on call tonight? I've noticed that you've been having a really bad week. I think that sort of give and take and also swapping shifts, somebody's got to be at the doctor, and they need to trade a time slot with somebody. Being flexible about those kinds of things and taking care of each other, I think, is one of the ways that we really do, make being on call, a lot more livable. And what are some things that we can do as individuals to cope? The flip side of that last point is that, maybe nobody taps you on the shoulder, right? Maybe you're having that really bad week and other people are just too busy to notice or whatever. If you need help, put up your hand and ask for it. I think it's really important to be able to do that. I think that we can look for ways to get that mental detachment. One of the ways that I'm very interested in is mindful meditation. Some of you may be skeptics like me. When I first heard about meditation, I would just roll my eyes, but they've done quite a few scientific studies, where they actually do brain scans, and they've shown the fact that it really can even change the brain. There's a specific kind of meditation that some teachers use that's focused on self-compassion. It's called loving kindness meditation. And I think that's a super helpful thing. And then therapy. I know that everybody's not in a situation where they can get therapy, unfortunately, and it's not necessarily easy to do. But I've been in therapy for a few years. I find it super helpful. I find it helpful to be able to talk to someone who's not judgmental and someone that I can trust, and also someone that's not one of my peers. And I think that's a really key point, right? Is that sometimes you want to be able to talk about work, but there are things that I would not tell my peers, because of privacy concerns or whatever. So having someone that you can talk to, is really important. Wanted to give a shout out to this book that my therapist recommended about anxiety. It's called When Panic Attacks by Dr. David Burns. I found it super helpful if you deal with anxiety. It really explains it really well and what causes it. Dr. Burns previously wrote a book about depression that's available as well. It's called Feeling Good. And both of those books focus on what's called cognitive behavior therapy, where you look at the negative thoughts that you have that lead you to be anxious or depressed. And they have lots of exercises in them. They actually did some scientific studies, and they found that people who used his book Feeling Good and did the exercises, even without a therapist, actually got better results than people who used antidepressants. And I don't want to come off as like against medications or anything like that. I think they absolutely can help, but they're, in these studies, people did get results just, doing these exercises by themselves. So, something I've learned in my career is that in the end, you have to be your own advocate. And I know this is harder for some people than it is for others. But, in the end, if you're dealing with a lot of on-call pain, you have to take responsibility for that. No matter how much you like your team, your manager, and your company, those other folks have different concerns. They have their own lives, they have other priorities, and you just can't trust that they're gonna take care of you. In the end, you have to look out for yourself. In some cases, if you're not able to make meaningful change in the shop that you're at, that might mean finding a new team that is better at doing on call, or maybe even going to a whole new company if you're not able to improve things. In my case, I actually got out of SRE, and I'm not recommending that you all quit your jobs today. That's not the point, but just acknowledging that that in the end we have to make these decisions and take care of ourselves. And most of all, I think that we have to be kind to ourselves, especially right now. There's a really great exercise that I like in that book, When Panic Attacks, where you imagine a friend who's in the same situation that you're in and what you would say to them to comfort them. And I don't know about you all, but for me, I'm much harder on myself than I am on other people. And when I do that exercise, I find myself saying a lot nicer things to myself that I would have otherwise. So, again, we just have to take care of ourselves and try to be kind. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate you listening. Thanks to the organizers. And if you do want to look at anything on those slides, like look up any of those studies, here is a bit.ly link where you can find them. All right, that's it.
Thank you so much, Rich. Does anyone have any questions for Rich? I know that we're going to move to the Q&A session, but if anyone has something on their mind right now that they want to ask him, don't hold back.
I've got one. Rich,
Yeah.
when you were sort of looking into this stuff, did you look into sort of stress-related disease and the studies that have been done around that? I feel like there's a lot of overlap, particularly in the studies that you mentioned.
Yeah, I didn't look at that specifically, but that's a great point. And I'm sure there are studies like that out there. One of the reasons why I wanted to mention the sleep studies is that for that same sort of idea, right, that there are, besides even on-call specific studies, there are even studies, in things that are related to it. When I did this, wrote this talk initially, I looked at, a number of studies, and it was just a tiny drop in the bucket, right? There's a lot of information out there, and as I mentioned at the top, I don't really hear people talk about this much. I even see a lot of talks about mental health and things like that, but I don't really see many times people digging into the actual, what actual scientists have found about, what we kind of do to ourselves.
It's kind of a terrifying thing to read some of the stress studies that they've done, mostly at this point on rats and animals, but it feels a lot like getting paged. They'll sort of randomly wake up the rats at unpredictable times with lights or with sounds, or maybe both, and then have them do some task that they were, that they could do previously to sort of see how they perform, and then similarly look at the outcomes, whether they generate heart disease or diabetes faster, or
Right.
a lot of times, I think one of the interesting ones is the impact to your reproductive health. A lot of times these rats can no longer have kids, which is something that I think when
Wow.
you think about taking on call as like a part of your job duties, you wouldn't normally think it's a trade-off in that scenario, but depending on how bad the on-call is, yeah, it can affect things you wouldn't expect.
Totally. And yeah, thanks. That's definitely one of the points I was trying to get at is, with the cortisol stuff, even is that, there, as a person who just is doing this job, right, there are things you might not be aware of or think of, that actually play a big part in your life. I remember like the terror of pager duty at times, right? Like I used to have this thing happen sometimes where I would wake up for an incident and I would actually get the incident dealt with. And then I would be anxious about trying to get back to sleep and worried that I might get another alert like an hour after I got back to sleep, which is certainly something that happened to me at times.
I feel like once you start dreaming about getting paged, you need to start looking at different options.
Absolutely. That's why I don't work for the government anymore.
I had a friend at a job years ago who left, and when I asked him why, he said that his eye started twitching, and that he had that happen at a previous job, and he knew that the point when his eye started twitching was when it was time to go.
We had a guy on call one time who fell asleep during the on-call, and he snored so badly we had to actually abandon the bridge and bring up another bridge.
Wow.
We tried calling him, yelling at him, calling him on a different phone, nothing. I mean, the only sign of life was the fact that all we heard was snoring.
I would give an immense amount of money that I don't have to be able to sleep well. This is something that's just a problem for me in general, which is one of the reasons why on call was maybe even worse for me than it might be for some people, because I'm a super light sleeper and have a lot of trouble sometimes getting, back to sleep after I've been woken up. I would give just about anything to be able to sleep on a conference bridge.
I'll introduce you to Adam and see if something can rub off on.
See if he has tips for me.
It's definitely an interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, sorry. I was just going to say, like on call's not going to go away probably unless you have like a follow the sun kind of situation where it's just during people's normal waking hours. And even that is somewhat stress inducing, right? Something broke. Yeah. So I'm wondering, you mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, which, that's an amazing, amazing thing that I wish lots of people knew about cognitive behavioral therapy. But I'm wondering if there's an approach, because we can't necessarily remove the stresses in our lives, but CBT tells you kind of like, well, how do you reprogram your response to those things that happen in your life? So it's not about avoidance, but it's about your reprogram. So I was wondering if you had any kind of thoughts about how you might be able to do CBT for on-call.
That's interesting. I don't know if I know enough about CBT specifically to be able to speak to that. I've done a little bit, but definitely not an expert. But there are some great people in that resilience engineering community. The folks at Netflix, especially, like Lauren Hochstein and Ryan Kitchens and some of the other people there. They have a really interesting attitude about on-call there in incidents. They have this phrase that I think it was Lauren who coined, where they call incidents operational surprises, and I love that. And incidents aren't necessarily good or bad, right? They're a thing that happens, and we can learn from them. And if we don't learn from them, it's kind of a wasted opportunity. And so I think that whatever you can do to sort of change that mindset might help.
One thing that I wouldn't say is a direct corollary to CBT, but it definitely has. I feel like it rhymes with CBT being sort of that reanalyzing reality and determining that what you thought reality was going to be doesn't necessarily always match up with how things actually ended up. One of the things that we've been doing on our RCAs is to ensure that we've got an entire section dedicated to how we got lucky. What were the good things that came out of the RCA? What were the redundancies we set up before that worked, that saved something? And we still probably had an outage. Something bad definitely happened, but where could things have gone wrong that they didn't? And that helps us reinforce that the work that we're doing, the changes that we're making are having an impact. It's not it's not learned helplessness, right? It's not things just continually getting bad and staying bad. We're making progress.
Yeah, there's something that those resilience engineering folks talk about a lot too, which is the idea that you should also be looking at what's going well, right? And that includes, how the system works just under normal everyday operation, but also that idea of the near misses, and Jolene, addressed some too. This thing that almost became a bad incident that didn't, because a human being was there and did the right things. We're part of these systems, and we're an important part of them, and a lot of the sort of safety protection that's there. And so yeah, I think you're definitely on the right track. I mean, for those of you who aren't familiar with CBT, the basic idea is that you have these sort of irrational beliefs, these negative beliefs about situations, and what you kind of do is drill down to like the core belief at the bottom of this thing, which is, it may start off with like, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, and then by the time you drill down, it's like, I'm afraid no one loves me, or something like that, right? That's you go through this path of sort of drilling down. And I think that likewise that we talked in our breakout that I was in with Mike and a few other people about the idea of psychological safety and trust, in the organization. And I think that's really a big key part of it too, right? Because if you're worried during your incident response that you're going to lose your job, that's a whole different level and a whole different amount of stress that's going to be put on you.
Thank you so much for this great presentation. I really enjoyed it. And it's always nice to hear more about the human side of tech. So thank you. This was awesome. And all the great questions. Thank you everyone for asking. I just want to take some time and invite you to our next meetup, which will be in next month in March 24th. I'm still looking for speakers. So if you want to talk or know anyone that would be a great speaker for this meetup, please reach out to me or to anyone of the co-organizers. We are taking suggestions, so please reach out and make sure to RSVP. I will share the link in the chat in a few minutes. I also want to invite you to join our SRE coffee hours, which will be on next week, actually on Friday. And this is a really good just networking meetup to join. We have no agenda, no speakers. Just join and discuss SRE news and network with us. So if you have some time and want to join at 9 a.m. Pacific time, then please do. I will also share the link to our CVP for this one below in the chat. And I will also share another link with you, which is the Meetup survey. I would really like for all of you to try and fill this one out. And give us some feedback on what we can do better, what we can do different. It's really important to us to keep up with a good meetup. So please take some time and fill out this survey. And if you brought a friend to this meetup or want to enter for an SRE coffee mug, which I forgot to include in this slide, you will have the chance to enter the information by clicking on this survey. I will also share the link in a couple of seconds. And thank you to everyone that joined. Now it's time for more discussion and questions. So I welcome questions to both Jolene and Rich, and or any type of discussion, anything you want to add, please do.
So Kit asked me to give a plug for our planning for SLOCon or SlowCon. What started as Kit being a narc on Twitter after I complained about Dynatrace and him tagging a bunch of Dynatrace people in the thread. That kind of morphed into we should have a conference based around SLO culture. And so I dropped a link in the chat to a Google Doc that came out of that idiot Twitter thread. And so we've, like a bunch of people have thrown in ideas for talks, different labs that we could do. I think it would be phenomenal for if you have any interest at all to check out our doc. And if you see something that you think should be there, throw it in. Rich, you should do this same talk, but we should make an SLO for mental health, and you should give this talk.
Oh man, I'd actually love to give it some more. This is actually the second time I did it as part of that. I don't know if everybody's heard of that deserted island DevOps thing, but it's the thing where they actually did the conference in Animal Crossing. So the first time that I gave this talk, it was my Animal Crossing avatar that gave it.
My 10-year-old is like mega jealous of that. Yeah, it's really interesting.
I was just going to say, one of our previous speakers that talked about alerting had talked about an SLO for alerts, right? And making sure that you are, like if you use up your budget of alerts, you should be aware of that, because obviously something is probably not going right.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I think that, pretty much every team that I was on always struggled with this, and always there's this balance between the stuff that you've got to do, those improvements that are going to help make the system less brittle and cut down on the amount of alerts and things like that, and the things that like the product team wants you to do, right? Like the infra you need to build, to enable this new business initiative or something like that. There's always a tug of war, between those things. And I'm curious if folks have like thoughts about what they've done to be able to sort of, I guess, get the capital, to be able to work on those infrastructure things that they know they need to.
One of the things I have my SRE team at the customer I'm at now, and my previous customer, we put a score on it. So like if we work on 28-day cycles for SLOs, we basically score that out. And so every time we have an SLO breach, or we trend over a long period of time, we have negative trends, we count that as an interruption. And then we divide that by however long our cycle that we're measuring it against. And that gives us a coefficient of we call it fragility in our system. And so if we have a high coefficient, we say, okay, hey, we can't take on any new feature work or any new request because we're getting brittle, right? But if we have a really low coefficient, we say, hey, we can pull more, we can go do a new engagement with a team that we haven't met with, or, we can take on some crazy idea that we cooked up. And so that gives us a way to just put one number on it over 28 days and say, how are we doing? And I don't think there's any executives here, so I can say it's easy for stupid executives to understand, right? Like it's one number. They don't need to look at a chart, anything. It's just like, oh, let me go check what the number is. And it's a 1. We're good.
That feels like a much easier buy-in. I feel like we've had a lot of struggle with kind of the traditional approach of like you breached now you need to work on reliability efforts until you are back above your SLO target. And that gets so much pushback from anyone that wants to ship features. So I really like this numerical value, because it not only gives you something easy to understand, but it lets you quantify severity maybe a little bit more effectively without having to teach people what error budgets are and burn rates and all that jazz.
Yeah, it's like I'm constantly fighting the battle where I have just like I feel like I have zombie hands reaching through the door wanting dashboards, and I hate dashboards, right? Like all it does is confuse. Like for an engineer, like for the 4 engineers working on something, they understand what those dashboards mean, what these charts mean.
Yeah.
For executives, they don't know. They think it looks pretty, and they read a paper one time that said they need this, like a wall of monitors. And so I like to imagine that our fragility coefficient that's our machete, and we chop off the zombie hands as they come to us. Like, check your score.
There's this just made me think of something. so someone had asked, I think after Jolene's talk about metrics, and I think that it's a really interesting topic, right? Because like, how do you really describe the health of the system? And there's a I don't know how many of y'all know Paul Osman, but he works at Honeycomb. He's a great guy, super smart. And I was talking to him once and was asking about this topic of, like, because there's some people out there who will tell you that things like mean time to detect and mean time to resolve, that they're useful signals, but they don't necessarily tell the whole story, right? And one of the things that he did was, they did a survey, like, internally, where they just asked the people working on the system, like, what their confidence in it was. And they would do that, I don't know how often, like maybe every few weeks or something. And that number that they would get from the survey was something that they included, in the stuff that they bubbled up, to the executives. And I thought that's a really interesting take on it, because there is that thing, like, I'm sure that everybody who's been on call at some point has experienced the thing where you just feel like the other shoe is about to drop, like, any minute, where it just feels like things are not safe, and like, I don't know how you would ever capture that, without doing something like that, without actually asking the people involved.
Yeah. The last government project I was on, we did anonymous surveys every week. Because we had five vendors and 70 something people working on it, and so we did anonymous surveys of, like, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about this? And so I would voice my anonymous opinion about systems I had no input to. And so that turned out to be a really good tell, because, you sit through these pointless stand-ups and scrums of scrums. In like a government project, that's 3-4 hours, and you're listening to people talk about something. You can only pay attention to something so long, right? But then asking anonymously, how do you feel like, this part of the project's going? That turned out to be a really good indicator of what was going to break next.
Your mention of, like, the executive request for these massive complex dashboards is intriguing. It's very familiar. Do you feel like I guess one of the pitches to me about SLO style measurement is you actually kind of have a way to normalize performance, like feature or service level health across teams, because you've got a normalized way to evaluate that. It's like good counts divided by valid counts or whatever. Do you feel like that is something that your team has, or have you like had to go through making something like that, like to take all these SLOs and try to push them into some unified dashboard, or is it more still?
I mean, right now,
for dashboards, you just say no, like, we're not going to do it.
I mean, yeah, if I can say no, I say no. 100% of the time, it's like, like, dashboards are great, but SLOs should allow you to not look at a dashboard, right? Like, that's the whole point. Is, like, I want to be alerted when we're trending in the wrong direction, and, like, then go look at the graph. Otherwise, I don't want to have to look at it. And I'm like, I try to push, especially for the engineers, for SREs and developers and traditional ops people, having them not have to sit and watch Grafana or Dynatrace or Datadog or one of the 20 million tools that are out there now. Like, those engineers, they need to be doing engineering work, right? And so dashboards just become like a new fancy cover up of toil, of just looking and watching a graph. That brings no benefit to an organization. And so if, like, we can set an alert and say, hey, if this line trends in the wrong direction for more than 15 minutes, page somebody during working hours, and let's fix it during working hours, because I don't want to be called at night, right? And, like, my contract now with my customer, I'm business hours only. Like,
Yeah. I will say that a couple of our wins that we've had since instituting SLOs is just that, where we've had errors or what issues come up post release, right, of a change, and being able to have some alerting, some idea that something's going on there is nice. Where our practice up until this point has been, well, stare at the dashboard post release and make sure nothing looks funky, besides the normal blip you see. And, I would say something like, what a waste of time to have this person that is so valuable staring at a dashboard post release, right? Especially if a lot of times nothing is happening, right? So I think that definitely is the power of those alerts. And what we've found is that, depending on the sensitivity and the level of the SLO, you can catch those things during working hours, which is the whole point where everybody gets nervous about, like, don't put alerts on SLOs because we might not know what to do at 2 a.m., right? Well, you're like, well, if you have these things tuned well enough, right, you will hopefully get to the point where things, you're getting these things that are drawing your attention in much, much closer to the time when the change, at least incidents caused by us kinds of things, as opposed to maybe, I can't control when AWS does something and takes us down. But
Yeah, and so it was really interesting. Latanya was talking a couple weeks ago about error reporting and using error reporting as a way to automate how deployments go. And that's something that I did at a previous job. We would not do alerts at night. Let's deal with shit during business hours, but we would do the GCP error reporting and have the little cloud console app on our phone. And so we could watch error reports. And, in the middle of the night while I'm eating dinner, I can look and see, oh, it's an error. It's not a big deal. I know that's not going to crater the system. I can ignore it. And then if we get a pile up of those, then let an alert go off. But those individual errors, I don't want to look at those, especially at 3 o'clock and 3 a.m.
Yeah, I guess oh, sorry, go ahead, Rich.
Oh, I was just going to say the whole, that whole idea of how do we know when something's broken when we deploy things is an area that I think there's been a lot of really great thought and work around, the last few years. There's a lot of people using that phrase progressive delivery that I think James Governor from Red Monk coined, but that idea that, using feature flags and canaries and things like this, we can do our rollouts in a more gradual, safer way. And, I keep going back to Netflix because I'm sort of a fanboy of what they do, but they, they have this whole scientific platform, where they run chaos engineering experiments and all these other kinds of experiments. And, when things get deployed, they route some traffic to them, to the new stuff and compare that to the old stuff. And they have all this sort of baked in, so it's just there for the engineers. It's super interesting. But I think, one of the key parts of that is feature flags, that's one of the things that really enables all of that work. And I also really like the tools that, I know Andrew's here from New Relic. There are more tools nowadays that have some sort of an API or something where you can tell them when you've made a deployment, right? So they'll record it and you can correlate that against other things that are going on.
Yeah, I think it feels like on our side, as we have been going down the SLO journey, part of that pitch has been to get buy-in from the exec side. To explain that this is how we're sort of evaluating feature health, and it gets that buy-in from product to also get the customer point of view. And then once that data is now quantified, it's not necessarily the engineers that want that overview dashboard, it's the execs. They want to see how is the whole site with hundreds of features doing, and how is each feature individually doing. And wonderfully with SLOs, the data is normalized, so we can actually drop that onto a page, and then teams can kind of, or I guess individual execs or product team can sort of filter through and say oh, I want, my team owns these features, this is what I want. But we had to build that custom in-house, and then it's normalizing data across a bunch of different monitoring systems, and it kind of sucked to have to build it. I was just wondering about anybody else. Yeah.
I tell executives or new engineers, they'll ask about error rates and things like that. and I tell them that if you get to the point where a system is spewing errors, it's too late. Like it's too late, right? Like if something starts spewing 500 somethings at somebody, like we should have caught that before. Like we want to catch that before, like number one, so we don't have to wake somebody up. And like before somebody gets a dead page or tries to, stick something in a database and it fails, like before that happens. And that's what SLOs should ultimately allow us to do, right? Is to see like when that line starts moving down instead of, holding steady or going up. Like that's when I want to, I want to know when the dip starts, what's causing that dip, and like let's spend engineering effort there rather than like scrambling and like and having to order pizza or like send everybody a DoorDash gift card every month and like, hey, you've got $50 of DoorDash. When we have to work at 8:00 at night, you can buy yourself a pizza or buy your kids McDonald's or whatever.
I mean, I think in theory, yeah, like having prevention be your main thing is wonderful, but in practice, that's kind of why postmortems exist, right? Is that there's always something else that was unexpected. Like hardware is going to fail in the middle of the night, and you're not going to know. It's just going to happen. So you're going to have those pages that are going to get, and you're going to have users that are on your system outside of business hours. Sometimes, I mean, not everybody, but some folks do, and in those cases,
yeah, absolutely. And Jolene's her risk matrix is
that was really good.
Like I wish I could just tape one of those to my forehead and just sit in every Zoom and like use the chart.
But I mean, I think it's a good point, and this is what those resilience engineering folks talk a lot about. With that idea of looking at what's going well with the system. Is that when the big scary incidents happen, usually it's not just one failure, right? Usually it's like several different things have happened that all have put us in this situation where we now have an outage where, like, had any one of them been prevented at some point, it wouldn't have gotten to that. And that's there's some really great examples of that. The Amazon S3 outage from like 2017, I did a write-up on that at one point, and it really surprised me when I dug into the timeline, because there's the initial problem where the person fat fingers the command, but when you look at the actual timeline, what took the vast majority of the time in that incident was they decided to restart S3. And at that point, they had never restarted all of S3 at once. Like, it's something they had literally never done. And so, they had trained for it. They didn't know how long it would take, and that ended up dragging on for hours and hours and hours. And so, it's, I think this stuff is fascinating. There's so much depth you can get into with like how you look at these incidents and learn from them.
I just want to say I was at Amazon during that outage, and it was cascading pain. It was just wave upon wave of pain.
Yeah, because so many other things depended on S3 that
it wasn't all of S3. It was IAD's S3, which happens to be the very first S3 that gets deployed, and it's like the oldest. So you end up with a lot of, this is a socio-technical problem again. You end up with a lot of teams that deploy things that are, for some reason, like hard configured to use IAD S3. And so when that one S3 goes down, then everything cascades. But it's, again, it's not like these individual points. It's that was
exactly what happened. Basically, the back end you had all these dependencies on the back end, and it was doomed.
I've run those same commands when I was at AWS. I've run those exact same commands, and it is a terrifying thing to try to script them out to reset that many hosts simultaneously. But
really,
it's like the power and the responsibility of being an operator there. It's like you can do some serious, terrifying stuff, and hopefully there's enough protection in place. But at the same time, you're not going to catch everything.
Protection got written around that because we had figured out that essentially with a single command line placed from the right spot, we could bring down all of AWS irreparably.
Was that the one that ended up with United had to have 2 on-calls all the time. You had to have someone watching the commands you type in manually. And so you could, if you
No,
page one
this
person,
was-
now you had to page 2.
No, this was where, like I said, we determined that we could write a single line command that would bring everything down. And at that point, we started to implement specific logins to Bastion machines and accountability that way. So we could at least tell who took everything down.
That's the start. That's definitely the best early start.
All right, Urza, I think we're well
Yes.
beyond.
Thank you. I got to go because I have another meeting.
Snack
Take
time
care.
over here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Great to meet
everyone. This was
everybody.
super fun.
Great
Thanks,
job,
everyone.
Rich.
Tell them bye, Henry. Tell 'em-
Bye,
He's
Henry.
not